God is a fairy tale. Harvard professor mocks believers until this woman destroys him in front of entire campus. The historic Sanders Theater at Harvard University was packed beyond capacity that fateful afternoon, with students crammed into aisles, and faculty members leaning against the back walls, all drawn by the promise of witnessing another brutal takedown of religious belief by the university's most feared intellectual gladiator. Professor Christopher Brown, a man whose TED Talks on atheism had garnered millions of views and whose reputation for eviscerating theistic arguments was campus legend, adjusted his microphone with the practiced ease of someone who had humiliated hundreds of believers in this very auditorium. As the overhead lights glinted off his designer glasses, he launched into what he assumed would be yet another routine demolition of faith, unaware that today would be different. Today, his carefully constructed worldview would face an opponent who wouldn't just challenge him, but expose the shocking intellectual bankruptcy of his entire position. Seated calmly in the third row, her hands folded neatly in her lap, 27-year-old White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt wore the faintest hint of a smile, the kind that suggested she knew something the arrogant professor didn't, that his entire intellectual framework was about to come crashing down around him in front of the entire Harvard community. The tension in the room became palpable as Christopher, with theatrical flourish, displayed a graph purporting to show the inverse relationship between IQ and religious belief. "The data doesn't lie," he proclaimed, his voice dripping with condescension as he gestured dramatically at the screen. "The more intelligent someone is, the less likely they are to believe in these primitive sky god myths that should have died. Out with the Bronze Age." His eyes deliberately sought out Karoline in the audience, his lips curling into a smirk as he added, "Though I suppose when your paycheck depends on pretending to believe nonsense, it becomes harder to think clearly." The barb was unmistakable. He wasn't just attacking religion in the abstract. He was personally mocking the young conservative woman who had dared enter his domain. A wave of nervous laughter rippled through the crowd, some students shifting uncomfortably in their seats while others leaned forward eagerly, anticipating the humiliation to come. But what happened next would shock everyone in attendance and send reverberations through academic circles across the country. With a grace that seemed to slow time itself, Karoline rose from her seat, the subtle rustle of her blazer cutting through, the murmurs like a knife. As she walked with measured steps toward the stage, the atmosphere in the auditorium transformed. Where moments before there had been smug superiority from the professor and uneasy anticipation from the crowd, now there was only electric tension. The microphone squealed slightly as she adjusted it to her height, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent hall. "Professor Brown," she began, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable edge. "You present yourself as a champion of reason, yet your entire argument rests on a logical fallacy so elementary it would earn a failing grade in an introductory philosophy course." The collective intake of breath from the audience was audible. Christopher's smile froze, his fingers tightening imperceptibly on the podium. Karoline continued, "Correlation is not causation, a principle so fundamental I'm astonished I need to remind a Harvard professor of it. Your graph proves nothing except your own confirmation bias." The room seemed to hold its breath as the young woman, barely older than the students in attendance, delivered the first of what would become a series of devastating blows to the professor's carefully cultivated reputation. What followed wasn't merely a debate. It was a complete intellectual demolition. Karoline systematically dismantled every one of Christopher's arguments with the precision of a surgeon, her words measured, but carrying the weight of undeniable truth. "If intelligence disproves God," she asked, her voice ringing clear in the hushed auditorium, "how do you explain Blaise Pascal, who laid the foundations for probability theory while writing profound theological works? Or Gregor Mendel, the father of genetics, who was an Augustinian monk? Or Werner Heisenberg, whose uncertainty principle revolutionized physics while he maintained a deep Christian faith?" Christopher attempted to interrupt, his face flushing, but Karoline pressed on relentlessly. Are we to believe that all these giants of science were secretly fools, Professor? Or is it possible that your narrow definition of intelligence excludes anyone who dares disagree with you? The audience, initially divided, now leaned forward as one, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary, not just a debate, but the unmasking of an intellectual fraud who had built his career on bullying rather than substance. The coup de grace came when Karoline, her eyes locked on Christopher's now pale face, asked the question that would echo across campuses nationwide. You claim science has explained everything worth explaining, Professor. Then tell me, not as an atheist, but as a scientist, where does human consciousness come from? Not the mechanics of neurons firing, but the subjective experience of being, of thinking, of standing on this stage and feeling the weight of this moment. Can your science explain that? Or is this one of those inconvenient truths you dismiss because it doesn't fit your predetermined narrative? The silence that followed was deafening. Christopher's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, his hands gripping the podium so tightly his knuckles turned white. In that moment, everyone in attendance realized they weren't just seeing a debate. They were witnessing the complete collapse of a worldview that had seemed unassailable just minutes before. The professor who had built his reputation on mocking believers now stood exposed as a man whose certainty far outstripped his understanding, his entire intellectual edifice crumbling under the weight of questions he had never seriously considered. The aftermath of that afternoon would reverberate far beyond Harvard's ivy-covered walls. Within hours, cell phone footage of the exchange went viral, amassing millions of views and sparking heated debates across social media platforms. Prominent atheist bloggers scrambled to defend Christopher, while renowned philosophers and scientists weighed in with surprising support for Karoline's arguments. Meanwhile, in quiet corners of faculty clubs and student unions across the country, uncomfortable conversations began taking place, not about the existence of God, but about intellectual honesty, about the dangers of ideological certainty, and about why so many in academia had been afraid to ask the same questions Karoline had posed so powerfully. As for Christopher himself, he was reportedly seen days later in the theology section of Harvard's library, poring over works by Thomas Aquinas and Augustine, his usual swagger noticeably absent. The image of the once arrogant professor humbly seeking answers he had spent his career mocking became a potent symbol of the day's deeper lesson. That true intelligence isn't measured by how confidently one dismisses opposing views, but by the courage to question one's own assumptions. Now, we turn to you, the reader. Have you ever encountered someone so convinced of their own rightness that they refuse to consider other perspectives? Do you think Karoline's arguments actually disproved atheism, or simply exposed the weakness of militant skepticism? Most importantly, in an age where we're quick to dismiss those who disagree with us, what intellectual blind spots might you have that need re-examining? This isn't just a story about religion versus science. It's about the danger of intellectual arrogance in all its forms. If this piece made you think, really think, share it with someone who needs to hear its message today.